Welcome everyone to this community event. I'm really happy today to have Kendrick Curtis, who is engineering manager lead at Codacy. Welcome, Kendrick. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
So Kendrick will talk about improving our team's code review process, which I know it to be a very heated topic and I can't wait. And then we will have plenty of Q&A after his talk, ask questions about the process, also tell stories about how you guys are managing this process in your team and have some, real world conversation about this. So I leave the mic to Kendrick and talk later in the Q&A.
Great, thank you very much for that intro. Right, so hi, I'm Kendrick. So just a little overview of what we're going to be talking about, which starts off by identifying problems with code reviews, potentially creating code review checklist, automating, controlling, adopting such a checklist, measuring success, because it's important to see whether things have worked, and then there's a Q&A at the end. So, just a little bit about me, like why do I have any standing to even talk about this to you guys, because I'm sure you're all also experienced engineering leaders yourself. So I'm currently an engineering manager at Codacy, but I've got 18 years in software. This is my third line management job, so I've done this a few times, and not just in people management. I also sort of joined places as a developer or senior developer and then grown into either a technical leadership or a Scrum Master sort of role. And I advertise myself as a thought follower, not a thought leader. What you're going to see today is not anything new and exciting that I've made up out of my own head, but ideas that I've sort of come across from other people and implemented in my working life. So this is based on my experience. You guys, I'm sure, all have your own different experiences. So some of what I would say will be relevant and some of it won't. So I hope you get some value out of at least a different person's perspective on the problem. So let's level up. And I like this GIF because, this guy's leveling up by his hair going white, and that's definitely happening to me at the moment, right? So a little story. In a previous role, because I only just got to Codacy, I've been here since November. In a previous job, which is a good example of when code reviews go wrong, code reviews were taking days to complete. So we had some PRs that had been open for months. Now, obviously, that's not just a code review problem. If you've got PRs that are open for months, this was to do with a PHP upgrade from PHP 7 to PHP 8. The code had gone stale. It took a load of rework to get it done a second time, and that's due to changing business priorities, which is perhaps a different problem. But even so, median time to first code review and actual completion was pretty high. It's like 3 days, something like that. So how did we fix it? Well, we made two changes. We made smaller teams, and we had a code review checklist workshop. Those sound pretty straightforward, but I think there is some subtlety worth talking about in both of them. And did it work? Yes, it did work. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here talking to you about it, because I would be referencing different examples or not even being allowed to do the talk. The first one is talking about small teams. This is the very standard, famous Amazon model of having teams that can be fed by no more than 2 pizzas between them. Though they never specify whether it's like a 10-inch pizza, is it a 14-inch pizza, is it like a stuffed crust, is it like a Pizza Hut one with like the burgers on the crust, because that's pretty chunky. Like you could feed a team of 20 with a couple of those. Anyway. The standard suggestion is make your teams to be no more than 4 developers plus all of the various other like your product manager, your product owner, your QA, all those other roles, because when you add them in, you get 7 or 8 people in total, and that's plausibly an okay quick lunch for 2 pizzas. So we had a situation where we'd grown, so we had 2 teams. of 8, and we turned it into 2 teams of, into 4 teams of 4. Now I'm reading this book right now, Team Topologies, which is very interesting. I highly recommend it. I haven't finished it yet, so I'm not going to talk too much about small teams. But it is not just a case of cutting the teams you've got in half, right? You want to set them up with functional areas, or be stream aligned with streams of work that need doing that are delivering value into the business, or set maybe one of them up as a platform team that's supporting the others, or whatever. Read the book. This is a talk about code reviews, not about team organization. But if you've got big teams, consider, can we make them smaller? Because smaller teams do that thing where there are fewer people to take responsibility for things, and therefore more people do take responsibility for things. It's not stuff that's just left for someone else to do, right? So we did that, and that, I think if we'd only done that, then I think we would have wound up getting faster code reviews, and code reviews getting picked up sooner. But that's not the whole deal, right? Because you can have a code review process which is, yeah, that's good. That's very fast. Is that actually what you want? Does that deliver value to your organization? Maybe not. So that's not the whole problem. But if you're going to change a process about how things get done at work, again, my experience in 18 years is that developers particularly don't really like being told what to do. And so if you're going to lead a process of change, then I mean, the way I do it, I'm going to keep on saying you, right? I mean me. I'm not trying to imply that all of my experience is exactly what you should do, but it's a kind of simpler way to talk, right? Yeah, you need to get buy-in for change, right? Your engineers have to want to solve the problem that you want to solve. So if you perceive there to be a problem of code reviews taking a long time, or code reviews being poor quality, then it kind of doesn't matter what you think. The engineers need to think that it's a problem. And almost certainly they will, right? If you have people who are engaged in your company's mission, who are engaged in the project or the product that they're building, if they're engaged in their own personal and professional career development goals that we as leaders support engineers doing, then they should want to solve the problem. But you do need, I think, you do need to generate that buy-in before engineers will try and actually solve the problem. First, you've got to identify, is it a problem? Are code reviews really taking a long time, and how do you do that? I learned about it in my previous organization because people complained about it. They complained about it in retrospectives, they complained about it on Slack, they complained about it to each other, that they had a code review that no one was picking up, which gave me an inkling that there might be a problem to do with code reviews. But you can also get some metrics on this, right? Even in Jira, which is famously terrible at actually giving you metrics on anything out of the box, then you can get a time and status widget on a dashboard, which will show you how long tickets are dwelling in code review, presuming that you've got code review state in your workflow, which, again, in my opinion, probably if code review is part of your team's workflow, probably you ought to have a workflow step for it. Because it helps diagnose these sort of problems. But if you're using something else like Codacy Pulse, then that has a cycle time explorer in it, which will also deal with time it takes for PRs to get raised and completed as well, right? So there are lots of other tools that will give you the metrics to see if there's a problem here. And then what I did was I worked with the people who found it to be the most problematic, who were in sort of more trusted leadership positions, to suggest to them, well, you know, I can see this is a problem. Why don't you raise it at our fortnightly senior leadership, senior developers chat? And they did. And so we have an idea that is coming from someone who's not me as the manager, but from engineers saying, hey, this is a problem and we want to solve it. And then it's my role to then support that, right? And even going into that call, like, I had an idea of what I thought might be a good outcome, but again, some of my favorite calls as a manager and as somebody at work is to go into a call with an idea of how to solve a problem, listen to what's going on really, and then actually come out with a different solution, because that suggests that somebody smarter than me has had a better idea, basically. And that's great. And so I was happy to then go, okay, well, we went in with this idea that maybe we ought to have a definition of done. That's, again, a fairly common thing that I'm sure a lot of you heard about, a definition of done that says, okay, how do we know when work is complete and we can pass it on to the next stage? It's a sort of checklist of items of, have you run the unit tests? Have you had the product manager review it? Whatever, tick, 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 tick. But I had been reading a book recently called The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, and it's great. I am going to spoil the hell out of it for you, but read it anyway. If you like medical stories, then so Atul Gawande was a surgeon, is a surgeon, still alive, as far as I know. And what he questioned was, why were different hospitals having different patient safety results, basically people dying or not dying on the operating table, in different locations with different surgeons. How could you do something to standardize the results coming out of theatre? And he, for some reason which I don't remember now, he went to find out about how the aviation industry did safety, because the aviation industry is famously very, very risk averse, and when things go wrong, then there tends to be they have crash investigations, they do a big whole process of making sure they understand why things went wrong and try and make sure it doesn't happen again. And that sounds great, right? So what does the aviation industry do in sort of standard operating procedure for keeping things safe? So he went and interviewed some pilots and found out about aviation checklists, and nothing happens in an airplane cockpit without there being a checklist involved, right? Before the plane takes off, there's a pre-flight checklist. Before they actually sort of, I don't know, turn the key off and walk out, there's a post-flight shutdown checklist. Anything that could possibly go wrong, there is going to be a checklist for. There is a book about that thick in every airplane, which is just a list of all the checklists to refer to when different things go wrong on your airplane. And the interesting thing is they're not super specific, right? There are not line items on how to restart the engine. What you'll have is a checklist around, if you have an engine failure, here are the things you should do. Like, have you restarted the engine? Have you flushed the fuel lines? Have you descended to a safe altitude? That sort of thing. And they're very, they're not specific. They are triggers to go and do something else, which means the checklists are short, and they need to be short because you're flying an airplane, right? And interesting, one of the checklist items is very often fly the plane. Because it turns out when you're distracted and in a high pressure environment, it's easy to forget even the basic standard stuff. And there have been aviation disasters where, because of trying to resolve something like an engine failure, then the pilot has crashed the plane into a mountain or something like that because they were too focused on fixing the burning issue rather than doing the standard stuff that needs to happen. That has a slight bit of relevance to us later, right? So in patient safety, you can see how, well, can we take this checklist idea and put it into surgery? What did he learn from that? This does turn into something useful to do with software, honest. So he then, all right, well, I'll make a checklist. And he wrote a checklist as a surgeon, took it into his surgery and started trying to use it. And it was a disaster. Nothing changed. He ignored it half the time because it turns out that surgeons also don't like being told what to do, right? And also the checklist he'd come up with was not necessarily covering the most important stuff that had the most impact. It tells the story of an example where I think it was a series of Detroit hospitals where something like 30%, 40% of people dying post-operatively were dying because they got an infection on the operating table and died post-operatively. And there's a well-known solution to this, right? It's really standard and obvious. It's to give a pre-operative antibiotic between 2 hours and 20 minutes before surgery, but it routinely wasn't getting done. And so he worked with this hospital chain to introduce a checklist with this on it, gave it to the nurse rather than the surgeon in the room, whose job was to make sure everything had been ticked off before surgery even started. And the number of people dying post-operatively for an infection like 6 months after the checklist had been introduced and adopted went down to 0. So it was super effective. And this is where software comes in, right? If there is something you could guarantee that happened on every code review every time, that would have a high chance of reducing a post-production incident, then you'd want to do that, right? Something like, have you run the unit tests? Really? Because that's a very common request step in code review processes, but does it get done every time? And can you guarantee it? Because if you can, maybe you can reduce the number of bugs that you're getting through to production, which is pretty interesting, right? So talking about how you get checklists, how I got a checklist into my organization. So we had a code review workshop, right? Where, again, Atul Gawande says very clearly, like, the checklist he came up with to start with was rubbish. It didn't even cover pre-operative antibiotics. You know, he had a whole team go away and spend like 18 months at the WHO, work out what the best 35 items you could possibly have to reduce patient safety incidents. That didn't work either, because it's a huge list of 35 things, and a lot of them are not relevant for any particular organization. The best way to get good quality checklist is to get the team itself to build it, which is why we're talking about having a workshop. What we did is we got all 20 developers across all those 4 teams in a room, split them up into little groups of 4, and got them to come up with their own ideas of what they thought should be on the checklist, and they conjured up a whole load of things that no one else had thought of. We brought them back together, put everything out there, voted on it, turned it into a checklist, which again in our first iteration was much too long. It was, I think it was again 35 items, something like that. I think we might have squeezed it down to 20 before we actually sort of productionized it, and had a go with it. So I thought it'd be interesting for us right now as engineering leaders to have a go. Let's use the chat. Let's all throw in a few ideas. If you were writing a code review checklist at your organization, if you were involved in that process, what things do you think should be involved in code review? Let's pop out the chat. Make sure that your chat setting is set to everyone, and give us some suggestions. And I will start with a lazy one, which is, have you run the unit tests? But as always, other people than me have better ideas. So
I'm writing right now.
I'm sure everybody's writing very long and complex answers, which is why it's taking so long. Yeah, does it depend on anything else? That's a good one. Does it come later? Naming conventions? Yeah. So I have had a guess on the next slide as to what some common things might be. So try and prove me wrong and find some really obscure, awkward things that no one else has thought of. Yeah, does it meet with conventions? Has it been peer reviewed? Has it been PM reviewed? That's an interesting one to put in a code review. For sure, in my last work, we had a step where the product owner and QA had to review before it proceeded. We had those as separate workflow steps because we had a ludicrously complicated workflow of about 27 steps, which was a nightmare to manage. Oh, that's nice. Is it even, have you even asked the right people to review it? Very good. Because, yeah, sure, you're going to get very long wait times if people don't feel like they're capable to do the review, right? And if you're in that situation, maybe you need to be like educating people or introducing pairing or something like that, so that the junior developers do actually learn the skill of doing code reviews. I'm going to dwell here for one more minute, and then we'll move on, and you can see how many I managed to get. All right, let's move on. So here's my idea. It's almost certainly not the best one. In fact, I'm guaranteeing it's not the best one. This is my example of a checklist. Like I say, your engineering organization will have its own needs. So please don't copy this. But things that you might find on a checklist might be, does the PR have a good description and screenshots? You know, if you are engaging somebody who hasn't actually done the work, they might not actually know what the work is, right? So actually being clear about what change you're making, that could be useful. Again, did you run the tests? Are there even unit tests? Does the code conform to some internal rules? I got that one from, I think a couple of you mentioned that. Are there any OWASP vulnerabilities, any security vulnerabilities? That is, does it actually do what it's supposed to do? This is my fly the plane, right? And again, maybe your code review checklist doesn't need to explicitly say this, right? Maybe this is just the thing that the developers do innately without you even having to say it. But if you're getting into a situation where developers are so like focused on reading the code for quality and security and so on, and they don't actually like engage their brain as to whether this is going to solve the actual problem you're trying to solve, maybe there needs to be a prompt for that. And again, you know, is there anyone else the change might be applied? Somebody mentioned in the chat, does the PR depend on anything else? That sort of thing. And so you can see that you can divide these up into groups like code quality, security, testing, coverage, company specific stuff. There's often like company specific, not just company conventions, but actual workflow steps. Like, have you bumped the version number? Or have you completed this build first, or whatever that's necessary to actually make sure the code was actually going to pass in production. Yeah, like I say, workflow steps, and then correctness and completeness, which encompasses, does it do what it's supposed to do, but also the sort of the complement to, does this PR depend on anything else, is, should you have applied this change anywhere else as well? Because that is often something that can be overlooked, right? That you've done it here, actually, you know your code has some level of duplication. And so should you also have applied it in these 2 or 3 other places? And maybe there's a prompt for that. You also might talk about localization, like have you translated all the strings, or have you done whatever your localization system requires you to do to make the strings available to the localization team, depending on how big you are. Have you done the corresponding database migrations, that sort of stuff. And on my step 4 here, how are you actually going to accomplish them? There's no point having a checklist step if you can't actually do it, right? It's a very common sort of expectation, at least in the 2010s around code reviews, is that one thing that the reviewer is going to do is check the code out and actually execute it on their local machine and see if it works. And that's a big commitment. You know, there's a big time commitment. You actually want your developer to have to tear down their local work, replace it with the stuff off the branch, and test it out just to see if this 3-line change actually works. That's very expensive. So you might choose not to do that. You might choose to mitigate that through other ways of, well, QA is going to look at this next anyway. Product's going to look at it on the dev environment or whatever. So do you actually want to spend the effort on that? The other end of the scale is automation. because there are some of these workflow steps that you can actually automate to a smaller or larger degree. And surprise, Codacy, who employs me for money, does this with their products, right? But we're not the only option. And I don't think we even cover all of these things with our products, right? Something like, is there anywhere else this change should be applied? That sounds complex, right? But actually, if you have some concept of where the duplication is, which should be automatically detectable, or if you have some dependency management, then perhaps that will give you an idea of where else you need to apply that change, even if it doesn't do the whole job for you. If you can see which repos this repo depends on, then that might tell you something useful. Did you check the code out and run the tests? Again, that very, very common thing. If you're using unit tests, integration tests integrated into your continuous integration scheme, then obviously they should be happening automatically. And a good scheme should be posting the result back onto your PR so that you know whether the test passed or not, actually right there in the PR. Because otherwise, if you're expecting people to execute the test locally, then A, you don't know whether they're actually going to do it, and B, you don't necessarily know the results. And then a few of you mentioned, does the code conform to some internal rules? That is obviously ripe for automation, like right there in the IDE. Have you got your IDE settings set up correctly to make sure that we're using tabs, not spaces? Sorry, spaces, not tabs, or whatever. And I'm sure there are some things around like how you name functions. If you have a particular scheme, you can automate those. So a lot of these things, in terms of remembering to actually do them, if you can have them done automatically, actually they don't even need to appear on your checklist. You can take them off and make room for other more important things, because this stuff is happening effectively for free, right? So what can you automate? What can you get off your checklist so that you can use those spots for something more valuable? I did mention adoption and enforcement earlier, right? Because again, creating a checklist and then telling everybody you all need to use the checklist is also not necessarily going to get you the results that you want or expect, because developers don't like being told what to do. So what can you do to try and make your code review checklist actually get used? In the checklist manifesto book, then eventually a lot of surgeries wind up settling on the idea that they put a little metal tent over the surgeon's scalpel that can only be removed by the nurse once all of the checklist items have been ticked off. There is a physical barrier to actually starting. And so again, if one of your automation providers can give you a gate right there in your PR, which is going to block you actually being able to submit the PR unless it's conforms with the rules, that's great, because that's automatic enforcement. That is the easiest way of doing it. You might think, and again, I've seen it done and abandoned several times, let's have a transition screen in Jira in the ticket provider, where you ask, here's your checklist, here are your boxes to tick. And what happens? I'm sure everybody knows what happens. It is that every single time, everybody goes and ticks every single box and presses go, and eventually that transition screen just becomes a step in the way of going to the next step. And so for me, if there is one bit of prescriptive advice I give in this whole talk, it is, don't do that. That is a waste of everybody's time. What we did was instead we changed the default description in Bitbucket in each repository to have the checklist there. And the nice thing about that was actually, it turns out that different repositories even had different needs for checklist items. And so as we evolved our checklist, then we were able to specialize it even further to be on the repo level. But that doesn't actually make sure it gets done, right? There will be some developers in your organization, I hope, who will look at this stuff partly because they were the ones who were complaining about it in the first place, or because they just have that very rigorous mindset that I've been asked to review something. Here's the code review checklist. I'm going to copy and paste it. I'm going to paste it. I'm going to go through every single item and say yes, 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 no, 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 yes, no. And that's obviously behavior we'd like to encourage. So when people do that, then shower them with praise. Make sure that that is understood to be a good thing. But another great way we found to make sure the checklist actually got done was to do mob PRs, code review meetings, whether it's the whole team or just 2 people doing the review. Then actually the framework for those meetings tends to evolve into, right, okay, step 1, have we completed the checklist? Okay, step 2, now let's talk about the code. Step 3, whatever. And so having an agenda for a meeting can also be a good way to make sure that the code review checklist gets done. And I think if the whole team is there, then there's a lot of accountability. There is someone going to say, have we done the checklist? Going back to the surgery example, then what Atal Gawande did was he made sure that it was not the most senior person who had control of whether the checklist needed to get complete, but one of the most junior people, and they had the authority and the responsibility to make sure it got done. And that seemed to work very well. So do you need to put the authority in hands different to what you might expect? And finally, listen to your developers. If any of these things aren't working, if your metrics for code review still suck, do something different, right? This is not prescriptive. This is an idea. There are other ways to do this. Codacy, we don't have a code review checklist. We tend to do mob PRs, and we seem to be quite thorough in terms of ticking a load of boxes. As we ourselves grow as an organization, we are going to be hitting some of the problems around dependencies between different teams and different repositories that we're going to need to confront fairly soon. And then maybe we will need to start having some significant process steps here to say, like, have you bumped the version? Do we even need to come up with a versioning scheme in between the different repositories to make sure that stuff is getting committed in the right order? Right. So we did those things. We made smaller teams. We had our code review workshop. We had our checklist. What happened next? Well, the first thing that happened, which is what we expected to happen, thanks again to the book, is that our first iteration of our checklist sucked. It was far too long and it took a load of time. But because we were committed to this iterative process, we're not just saying, okay, here it is, job done. Then because we had these 2 weekly check-ins, not just about the checklist, but about anything else the developers wanted to talk about, then we pretty immediately started getting feedback on, can we combine those 2 items? We need to have a new item. Nobody's doing this one. Should we get rid of it? And that list grew and changed. And like I say, we specialized it into different repositories as we went along as well. I didn't come up with the idea of code review meetings or mob PRs. We had another developer who was also a certified Scrum Master in one of the other teams who started doing it with his team. And then the other teams saw that it was happening, watched it, tried it. Some of them adopted it, some of them didn't. And it worked for them or didn't work for them. Allow the teams the space to iterate, to make it better. You'll not get it right first time, and that's totally expected. So stick with it. But we did turn down the time, at least, from taking more than 3 days on average to less than 8 hours. And we were doing some like scrappy Excel tracking of how many checklist items actually got ticked off. And again, we saw compliance with those rise, not just from individual PRs, but individual developers over time, from something like 25% initially up to something like 55% at the point that I left. And we were still iterating and improving at that point, right? I would have loved to have been able to automate and enforce some of those rules, like, have you run the tests? Have you written the tests? But I didn't know about those until I joined Codacy and found out our products do them. I just talked about iteration is important, so I'll skip over that. Yeah, and measuring your success. So I was measuring success with a time and status widget. We now have this concept of DORA metrics, which were ideated in the Accelerate book by the State of DevOps people. The idea that you can actually get some meaningful engineering metrics and start to optimize and actually see improvements in your teams is super helpful, and sort of time in code review is a feed into one of those metrics. Before I talk about this, I keep on getting this bit wrong. I have to ask you, before I go on to tell you about DORA metrics, what it is that you do to measure engineering performance in your teams. Tell us in the chat. So do you, I mentioned cycle time, I'll give you that one for free. But do you use Jira? Do you use sprint reports? Do you use sprint velocity? Do you do individual performance reviews? How do you figure out if your teams are performing? Because code reviews is a sort of part of this process, right? Use Linear B. Good idea. It's a quite nice platform. They've got a good blog as well, like that. Anyone else? Because certainly my experience of this was previously essentially nothing. Don't believe that there are any useful engineering metrics out there, so we're not even going to try. But actually, having gone through this process, we used a metric of time in status code reviews to optimize our development process. So surely there are other steps in the workflow that we can optimize in, not just time in code review. PR turnover, cycle time, and velocity for scoping. Cool. You're ahead of me then. Or you are ahead of the me that was involved in this code review process. And there's the endless pressure to resist sprint velocity inflation, isn't there? In that, well, you did 60 points last week, so surely you can do 62 points next week. Okay, that's fine. We'll just overestimate all of our tickets a bit more then. So it is super important to be careful what you measure, because otherwise people game whatever system. The big challenge is finding metrics that are good enough, that overlap enough, that if you try and game them, you actually improve stuff. Right? So if you don't know the DORA metrics, these are the deployment frequency, lead time for change, time to recover, change failure rate, and then at the bottom, cycle time, which is not one of the DORA metrics, but I think it's actually a super important thing and can be significantly affected by code review, because that's the time it takes from moving a ticket from to do to in progress to done, right? It's that in progress step, and code review can take a big piece of that, because it can be asynchronous. I open the PR, I wait 2 hours, nobody comments, I chase them, I wait another 2 hours, somebody the next day finally gets around to it. Suddenly a 3-line change that took me 5 minutes has now taken 8 hours to get from to do to done, right? And obviously there are other things in cycle time as well, and also like lead time for change is sort of connected with that. If you're doing Git flow with release candidates, then you can be in a situation where your lead time for change can be weeks, right? Whereas we like to be in this sort of hours grade in most like consumer-facing SaaS platforms. So they're worth investigating. They will be impacted by code review and by other stuff as well. And obviously, I mentioned we have a product that does it, so it's worth mentioning. That is my entire talk. Q&A, I cannot, as I say, I feel like we're all a bunch of engineering leaders with our own skills and experiences, so I guess this is more of a debate than a Q&A. I absolutely do not believe I have even a sizable fraction of the answers here, but let's go.
Thank you so much, Kendrick, for the great talk. So let's start with some questions, guys. You can raise your hand in Zoom and then unmute yourself and ask questions. Whoever wants to start, otherwise I have questions myself, of course.
And apologies for being over time. I should have looked at my watch.
No problem. So if if everybody's shy, I will start. So let me start by just praising the checklist approach, because I think you showcased how it works well with code reviews, but I think it can be generalized for almost everything. I think checklists are one of the few, devices that help you both with going faster, because you don't have to remember all the things, in your head, and also to create higher quality, because they make sure that you remember the right things. And they're also like the minimum viable docs. They also document how you do stuff. So if you have junior people, I mean, that they go through the checklist, they learn a lot, and they can be onboarded in processes much faster. So I'm 100% on board with that. I have a question. So one of the divisive topics about code reviews, it's also that they usually spend a lot of time idle. Just there's a lot of time that passes before somebody picks up the review. So I wonder if you have any advice about that, how to minimize, that time, or how to find, the right compromise, because it's not like people can drop everything that they are doing to do their PR, or should they? I mean, maybe, I don't know. So do you have any suggestion for that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is an interesting thing about cycle time, right? That actually there is a not only there's a minimum cycle time which is good, right? You don't actually want a cycle time where every single ticket passes in 30 seconds, because that suggests that you're not taking enough time in code review, and it suggests that people are actually being interrupted in the work they're trying to get done to go and do reviews. So it's for sure a difficult balance. I think there's a lot to explore there. I have seen organizations where the only person allowed to do code reviews in a team is the lead. I would suggest that that's a bad idea, because then you're depending on that person's time a lot. And so can you generate pairs where you have a junior who is having their code reviews reviewed by one of the mid-levels, and the mid-levels by a senior. So that's freeing up time, right? You're not expecting everyone to review everything. And therefore reviews are more likely to happen more often. And if you've got a well-defined relationship, people know what their responsibilities are. And again, my experience in a lot of organizations is the senior lead people are just underwater with requests from other people, and being able to cut that down is going to be super helpful, not just in terms of code reviews, but in terms of their own personal productivity, right? Another thing I think is that I've seen work very well is to have checkpoints through the day where, for example, straight after daily stand-up, are there any code reviews open? Then we're going to carry on the stand-up call. The developers can stay. We'll do a mob PR on whatever is open right now, so that that's not necessarily compressing your cycle time particularly, but it is giving you a very defined cadence. So if I have got it done by this time, then it's going to get picked up at that point. And when you do that, developers tend to learn that and learn to push the extra 5 minutes the night before to get it over the line, so it's ready for the daily, so that it can get reviewed, so it doesn't stay for another 24 hours. But I also say to senior and lead devs who are highly contented in their time, right, yes, book out some focus time, from 2 till 5 or whatever, but make sure you are leaving spots in your day where you're going to get your head up and do code review or whatever. And it's all, I pretty much say that, code review or whatever, the code review being the important thing that's going to push the delivery on, right? So I think there's a few different ways, and I bet other people right here also have better ideas on how to do that.
Yeah, we can extend the question to anybody here. I mean, if anybody wants to join this conversation or ask for any other question, guys, feel free to raise your hand and ask for anything. Anyway, I agree that there are many approaches. It's not like silver bullet, but it's like embedding in the culture the fact that you should do code reviews fast anyway. So you have checkpoints throughout the day. Maybe you have notifications. Maybe you block focus time. So I agree. Fabrizio, I see your hand. We don't hear you though. We had you at the beginning, so it's not. I don't know what's happening. Now you're mute.
Now is it working?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
Now I'm green. Perfect. Thank you, Luca, and thank you, Kendrick, for the intervention. Your talk was pretty good. I have another question. It's not related to the topic, and it's like, do you think it's a good idea to have junior engineers reviewing mid or senior PRs? So basically having younger people or junior people reviewing the code of the most experienced people in the team.
Yes, absolutely. How else are they going to learn how to do it? They've got to review some PRs, otherwise they're never going to learn how to review PRs. You wouldn't necessarily merge it to master on the basis of a single tick from a junior developer, right? But if you're even if you're using something like Bitbucket Pro, then you can configure it to require a minimum of 2 ticks, right? So, or to require ticks from a certain group of people. But absolutely, junior devs should be encouraged to do it, and even pair on it with other people, because it's a development activity, right? And they've got to learn how to do it.
I agree that you can also make it in a way that it's not maybe necessarily blocking, right? You either pair on the task, or you can do the review without making it a blocking passage for before deployment, in case the person is junior and it's more for knowledge sharing maybe than for actual.
Yeah. The interesting thing about doing mob PRs or code review meetings is that you kind of get that for free, right? Everybody joins the call, and so the junior developers hear the questions other people are asking and learn that way, and then they will themselves the next week go, did we complete the checklist?
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Other questions, guys? So I go myself with another one. So let's say you have the checklist in place, and let's say you also, as you said, automate as many as these steps as possible, right? Through your CI/CD pipeline, with automated tests, linter, etc. And then you are left with a bunch of checks that humans have to do. Okay, so do you believe in treating all code reviews like the same, without considering how large it is or how critical it is, what part of the code base? Or do you believe, as I've seen in some teams, but it is still a bit controversial, that, for example, small code reviews maybe can go online without review, or maybe with a review that gets done afterwards, so it's not blocking, and this is done differently that with, for example, a large review? I mean, do you believe in treating reviews differently, or the same process for everybody?
I have seen many one-line PRs go horribly wrong. And so I guess I would say, I think probably like theoretically you could treat different PRs differently, but how do you tell which are riskiest? If you have a repository which is just CSS, and the worst you can do is screw up the view layer, well, even that could be critical. If you're an e-commerce site and you screw up the CSS, then you might lose like tens of thousands of pounds. So even stuff that you look at and go, well, that's a sort of trivial markdown language, how hard can it be? Even that can have huge impact. So yes, but how do you choose?
I agree that it would be hard in an automated way. I agree, because it's not a matter of, as you said, lines of code, for example, right?
I mean, I think you could do something again clever with automation, and I don't think anybody is doing it yet. Where if you have 100% unit test coverage, if you have 100% either integration or browser level coverage, and you've made a change, and you can use your dependency graph to show you that a very small portion of the application depends on this change, then maybe you could calculate some sort of risk score by which you could alter it. I don't think anybody's in that space yet.
Yeah. Otherwise, you would have to leave this to the judgment of the single person who says, to me, this is non-critical. I request a review, but after, it's not blocking for release. But I get that this is a risk. So that's why I think it's controversial, because I know teams who do this, but not everybody is on board with that. I mean, I just wanted to know what you think.
Yeah, and I guess perhaps this is something that a super mature team. I've not worked with a super mature team for a very long time. It might have this sort of innate knowledge between all of them to understand like where the risk is and to be able to say, yeah, that's probably fine. I mean, to a degree, you have to make those risk assessments if you're doing things like a patch to production in what's normally a very high cycle time system. You've got a production incident and you need to send something out to resolve it. And you don't necessarily have the confidence that you can get out of tests that's going to prove that it's definitely going to work, then you're going to lean on your senior engineers to give you the sense, like, how risky is this really? What's our like backup plan if it goes wrong? So I guess in that sense, that sort of stuff does happen.
Not clear. I agree. Kendrick, for what it's worth, I mean, I also appreciated your reference to the two pizza team being unclear, to say the least. For me as an Italian, I mean, when I first read about two pizza team, I thought, okay, it's two people then. Right? Instead, then I learned it's maybe 8 people, and I thought, how can it be? But then I learned it's whole another culture, of different pizzas. But I share your doubts about this as being as a good example. I don't think it is.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. So thank you everyone for joining this. As I told you at the beginning, we have recorded this video, so we will share it in the community as well. We will publish it on YouTube, and we will also split it into multiple, also short version with the various single nuggets of insights that Kendrick gave us. So thank you so much, Kendrick, for giving this talk.
You're very welcome again. Thank you for having me.
So thank you guys again, and we can wrap it up, and let's see each other in the community, and we can also follow up the conversation when we post the video in the comments there. Thanks, you, everyone.
Kendrick. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.